That was testimony from earlier in the Natalie Bobo trial from Jason Autry, the state's key witness, star witness in this case, where he throws a shot at the Bobo family and says, well, hey, look, I heard that your brother was cooking meth with my buddies. A lot of people don't think it was true, but that's what he said on the witness stand. Cathy Russon is our senior trial producer here at LawNewz. She's going to join me now for a little question and answer about the case. Good to see you today, Cathy.
Good to see you too, Aaron.
Okay, so we're taking some questions, and I'm going to start on Twitter here. Well, why don't you start with what you're hearing? What should we answer here?
Yeah, so I did ask on Twitter and in the chat rooms to hit us up with questions if people have them. So you can still be doing that while we're on the air. All right, New York Justice Seeker asks, why do you think Zach Adams didn't testify? And well, we have a couple of thoughts on that, I think, you and I, Aaron.
Yeah, I mean, some of this is procedural, and I'll sort of run through this analysis as cleanly as I can without getting too bogged down in what it says. First of all, the defendant, as I understand it, has previous criminal convictions. So if a defendant has previous criminal convictions, those can come into a trial to impeach his credibility if he testifies. So as a threshold inquiry for almost every criminal defense attorney, if the defendant has previous convictions on his record, the advice is do not testify. I mean, and it usually starts and ends right there. So some of the defendants we've seen testify who do not have previous criminal records are people like Stephen Jones in Arizona. He's the one accused of shooting the classmates on the Northern Arizona University campus periphery. He testified, and part of the reason he did is because he was clean. He didn't have a prior record, so there was nothing that the state would have been able to throw back at him if he took the stand. We also saw it in the Eric Campbell trial. There was nothing there that the state could throw at him. But in this case, they could have just brought all of his other criminal activity at him. And so by not testifying, a defendant is also preventing the jury from hearing about his other criminal record. That's usually where the analysis stops. There are some other reasons in there too, but that's usually the most critical one.
Right. So yes, there's that. Now, my thing is he was never going to testify. People were kicking this around, giving analysis about it or kicking it around on Twitter in the chat rooms. And I said from the day one, he's never going to testify. First of all, it's rare that a defendant gets on the stand. And for the reasons that you just stated and more, they're subject to cross-examination and can ruin any chance they have of an acquittal or a lesser charge or something. Well, in his case, I don't think it does him any good at all. I think there's not a lot of hard evidence linking him to this case. I think they built a great circumstantial case for sure, and with some eyewitness testimony and such. But he would do nothing but hurt himself getting on that stand because he's not a good guy, right? And a jury doesn't want to hear from what they consider the bad guy, even if they don't think he did this. He's not a good guy. I mean, he'd admit to his drug problems. He'd have to admit to all his criminal history. I don't know that he'd be a great witness. We haven't really heard him speak a lot, just short answers to the judge. So I don't know how he comes across that way. But I never thought for a minute they would put him on the stand.
Yeah, I assume not either. Now, there's another issue here, and it involves getting into a bunch of what ifs, but I'll indulge in it a little bit. One issue that defense attorneys have to worry about is if their client gets up on the stand and then lies about something, and this gets really state specific, but here's the bottom line. All attorneys are officers of the court and therefore are under oath, okay, an oath of office to ensure that no falsehoods and lies are told in court. So if a witness gets up on the stand and the attorney knows the witness is lying, one of two things happen in all of the states that I know. There may be other versions of this, but here's how most states deal with it. In a lot of states, if the witness lies about something, the attorney has to stand down and cannot do anything to assist with what's going on the stand because as an officer of the court, you can't be involved in the perpetration of a falsehood. Now, that's one possible way to deal with this. In other states like New Hampshire, where my first law license is from, if somebody gets up on the stand and lies, the defense attorney has to just flat out withdraw from the entire representation. Can't do a thing, and the defendant is literally on his or her own. And again, now this is if a defendant utters a falsehood. So, sometimes, and I'm not saying that this would have happened in this case, but sometimes defendants don't get on the stand because they realize that, if I start spinning garbage, my attorney is going to leave me, and I don't want that because I need the attorney's help through the rest of the case. That's a huge what if, but that's another procedural reason why oftentimes defendants don't take the stand. In this case, it's most likely that he wanted his criminal record outside the view of the jury. And again, it has to do with whether or not it's being brought in as evidence or whether it's being brought in as impeachment. I mean, there's a double jeopardy clause. You can't just bring in a defendant's previous criminal record just for the heck of it, because that gets into a double jeopardy argument, and that's not fair. But if a defendant becomes a witness, it comes in as against the witness, and that overrides the double jeopardy presumption. So that's a long version of why this guy probably didn't take the stand, but that's what the best of us have to say about it.
Yeah, right. Okay, sorry, I'm in the middle of this. I'm trying to get more questions in. All right, WC from the chat room wants to know what the federal charges are. So we've heard about federal charges, but we've also heard about, like Jason Autry got federal immunity. So we've heard about the feds in this case. And what do you know about that?
I'm really trying to remember what I know about this, but I was under the impression that he was charged something related to weapons because he had a previous record. And when they picked him up, they found him with a weapon, and that previously, and that's what they hooked him on in this. I mean, it's not an uncommon tactic for law enforcement when they start to suspect someone of something. If the person has a previous record and can't be a felon in possession of a firearm, the minute they see somebody with that, they grab them on that charge as they build the case on the serious charges. I remember hearing that that's what happened with Autry, but I'm saying this in the broadcast, but I'm also going to say don't quote me on it because I haven't dug into the federal charges that much, but I think that that's what that charge was. It was a federal felon in possession of a firearm charge.
Right, and both Zach Adams and Jason Autry, I believe, are being held on federal charges. Okay. The same chatter asks us, why isn't the kidnapping a federal charge? When does that become a federal charge?
Off the top of my head, when you transport somebody across state lines. So again, it has to go with the presumption under the Constitution that the federal government is one of limited powers. And, legally, that's still pretty sound, despite politically us having this huge debate about how big the federal government either is or should be. That's a big political question, but constitutionally, it is indeed a government of limited powers. And the bottom line is that something's not a federal crime unless it triggers some other area of the Constitution that the federal government has jurisdiction over. What are things that the federal government can do? Well, it can raise armies. That's why military justice issues are federal issues. What else does the federal government have power over? Interstate commerce. This is why a lot of federal crimes require transporting across state lines. Unless that happens, it's not a federal charge. Why does the federal government have the power over aviation and railroads? Again, interstate commerce. So stuff involving those things involves, in the eyes of the Supreme Court, instrumentalities or tools that are predominantly used in commerce back and forth between the state, federal charges. If it's just a crime within a state's border, then it's a state charge.
Right. Yeah, that's my understanding. Basically, it crosses state lines. Okay, so the same New York justice on Twitter questioned about Holly Bobo's cousin, Natalie Bobo. So she wanted to know, has she spoken out about this case? We didn't see her testify. So this is what we know about Natalie Bobo as far as what's come out in the trial, is that Jason Autry testified that Zach Adams knew Holly Bobo because Zach was having a relationship with Natalie Bobo. Okay. Jason Autry says that Natalie is a stripper at a local club there. And that, now this is from Jason Autry saying Zach Adams told him that Natalie said Holly would be willing to have a threesome with Zach and Natalie. Now, that's what came out during Jason Autry's testimony. And people have asked, why hasn't Natalie testified? And, if you really think that through, you would think the state would put her on if that wasn't true at all. Or, does it really matter? I mean, because it's not like, I don't think this story wasn't that, he was headed over that morning to have a threesome at 7 a.m. So I don't think that that's exactly, I don't know. I don't know why Natalie didn't testify. And apparently she was on a, I don't know if it's Reddit or Topics or something. She's been in some room saying that she was not asked to testify.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it may be that she had nothing material to add. And some of this stuff coming out of Autry, I don't know whether or not I can trust all of it, some of it, or none of it. And, this is the real danger for the state in pushing the case the way it has. I'm not there to read everybody. I don't run into everybody locally. I've never been in this community. But part of me has to think that at least one juror, and probably more than one juror, will sit there and say, okay, what that came out of this guy's mouth can we believe and what can't we believe?
Well,
and
that's
this is just another one of these big what ifs.
The credibility of Jason Autry is at question, right?
Oh yeah.
And that some of the things he said were so outrageous that you think, really? And then other things, I talked about this when I came on air the other day, that about what the jury is going to do with Jason Autry's testimony, and they may very well just break it down. I don't think they're going to throw it all out. I think they might just break it down and say, I don't know about this, but this seems believable because X, Y, and Z. We had somebody else testify about that too, or the cell phones put them where Jason Autry say they were. So I think they're going to maybe take part of his testimony. So I don't know. So that's the answer to Natalie Bobo. And the question was, has she spoken out about the case? I haven't seen any articles written that she's officially spoken out. And when I said that she made a comment in a forum somewhere, I simply got that from one of our viewers. I have not seen it myself. So I don't know that for a fact.
Yeah, and if it hasn't been on the stand, then I haven't seen it, because yeah. I have to determine where to spend my time and my attention. And digging into it beyond the legal records and everything usually is something that kind of falls off the table, because I'm trying to make sure we've got the law right, And but yeah, I mean, this is one of these stories that, of course, the whodunits, the what ifs, the other possibilities are relevant to the overall big picture, because look, I mean, it's there are a lot of unanswered questions here, and I recognize that. I also recognize that I'm not necessarily sitting in a position to go chasing after every single one of them. So yeah, I mean, the jury's going to have to figure out what the deal is with Autry. The bottom line is he comes across like a good old boy, aw shucks, and he's likable, but he's got this really dark side, and he says he's involved in parts of this, but not the most serious parts. He's just involved in a lot of the serious parts. And he's trying to wrestle with his own conscience, along with charming everybody in the courtroom, even though he's got this really dark side, and apparently it comes out from time to time. But so that's a hard kind of a witness to unravel all the way.
Yeah, I mean, that's their star witness. That's the state star witness, and the case just very well may hang on him, whatever he had to say, and what the jury believes about what he had to say. I do believe that some of the cell phone testimony corroborates what he said. I do believe that they can corroborate his story. The problem is, did Jason Autry have access to the state's case because he's a co-defendant? So did he know what they had and tailor some of his testimony around that so he can get out of prison? I mean, these are the things that are jail. These are the things that the jury is going to have to take into account if they even think about that. The closing arguments are what's going to be very, very telling in this case.
Oh yeah, I mean they're going to really have to stitch this up well. So these attorneys are going to be pulling some serious time this evening, probably as long as they can keep themselves awake, to make sure that they've got this buttoned up. I'm really, really, really curious to see where this thing goes on the defense's end, because I think that they've got a lot of loose ends to try to clear up, and the way that the case was tried is not making it easy. So, another question that I'm seeing jump across right here was Holly's cell phone ever found? I don't know the answer to that. Kathy, do you?
The SIM card was found.
Yeah, the SIM card was, but I don't remember about the whole phone.
But, oh yeah, the phone was found, yes.
Okay.
So we had testimony from someone who knew Holly and was a friend of the family. And, everyone was out searching at one point in time. And apparently this person found Holly's phone. And when she saw it, she recognized it because she had actually borrowed it and used it before. So the SIM card was separate, and that was found separate. So yes, they do have the phone. That was identified in court.
Yeah, a couple of other things here. Of course, get this question all the time. Aaron, guilty or not guilty? I don't like to ever say one way or the next. There's a couple of cases where I have, even though I don't like to, because it just seems the evidence is overwhelming. The War Machine case that we covered was one such case. That seemed pretty clear cut to me. But I think there's a strong probability of a conviction here. I would not necessarily be surprised if there's an acquittal, but I would kind of be surprised, if that makes sense. And I know I'm kind of hedging on it because, look, I mean, the jury observes more than I can observe sitting here and watching the camera feed. So I might think a witness is coming across great, but if the witness is smooth up here but is fidgety down below where I can see it on camera, the jury can see that, I can't. And the jury's noticing the eye blinks and the twitches and the movements and this, that, and the other thing. I think that if the jury takes all the evidence into totality here, they're going to turn around and say, okay, look, this guy was somehow involved. We're buying what the state is selling in the big picture. But they might not want to go for the top penalty here because it turns into how much of Autry do we really believe? We might believe that he's involved, but do we believe that this defendant is the defendant that pulled the trigger? I don't know. Well, then you've got a felony murder rule thing coming in. So they might convict. They might not give the death penalty. I could see that happening. If they acquit, it's going to be because they're really holding the state to its burden and saying, well, you've got a bunch of witnesses on the stand in this case who have a lot to gain from lying, and the jury could find that as well. I think there's a lesser probability that could happen, but it could. So
I'm going to say from my point of view, if I was on this jury and hearing everything that I heard in court, I'd convict him. So I think I'm there without over analyzing the case, which is what you and I do. But from the jury's standpoint, I think there's enough. I think that there's enough circumstantial and evidence in its totality to convict him. I have a question. Paul Stanley has been a guest a few times during this trial. He's a freelance journalist right there in the area. He sent the question and said, what is the probability of Zach Adams being convicted of murder but not guilty of kidnapping and rape? You think of how that would happen?
Well, I could, because it doesn't sound like Zach Adams is the guy who was involved in necessarily taking her directly away from the home. There's this big what if about who exactly that was that the brother claims to have seen wearing the camouflage and everything. I could see that, because they could turn around and say, well, we're believing we're believing we're believing Jason Autry that this guy shot her in the head, but that maybe he wasn't involved with some of the other stuff.
But isn't kidnapping still keeping her in Shane Austin's trailer and not letting her go? If you believe the whole story, he's involved in that.
Well, again, I guess they could parse it out and say, well, he wasn't primarily responsible for grabbing her and taking her there. It's going to depend on how much they believe this was truly a conspiracy, or whether these guys were sort of a band of buddies, and then this thing just started to snowball, and they made it up as they went, I guess. I think that's what the jury would have to ultimately determine. In order to convict him of everything, they're going to have to find a lot more premeditation. Which again, I mean, I guess that they could find, because we've got this testimony from the friend saying, oh yeah, I saw this guy like eyeing us weird at this event or whatever. So they might think that this was fully planned out, and they might think that it wasn't fully planned out too, because you got Autry saying, oh yeah, we decided to hide the body there, and we cooked that idea up on the fly. I mean, look, in theory, anything is possible.
Right. All right, Jim, that's his chat name. Why did the state give so many people immunity when it seems like, I just lost it, when it seems like they were all involved? So this is what we talk about in a lot of trials we cover here on Law News Network, is making deals with the devil, making deals with the lesser of evil, of the two evils, to get the main guy. Or to get any guy. In the Bella Bond case, many of us think Rochelle Bond should have never walked away unscathed from her part in that. But, without her testimony, there's no conviction of Michael McCarthy. And Michael McCarthy was not flipping on Rochelle Bond. So they would have had no conviction. And so they made a deal with her. And so that's what happens in these cases. Sometimes when you don't have any physical evidence and you don't have any DNA, you've got to go with the co-defendant and give him immunity.
Well, it ultimately turns into a debate about what justice should be. And this is an issue where I can look at it from the pure moral standpoint and say, well, maybe they should all get the same or similar punishments depending on their involvement. But it's the way it is. Sometimes the person who runs to the police first gets rewarded with a much lesser charge for that. Now, keep in mind, in this case, they've got Autry facing a lot of pretty serious charges. He just says he's hoping for leniency. I don't know if it's really clear how much leniency he's going to get, though.
I've not seen the immunity agreement, and I'm not sure.
It's only a federal immunity agreement for Autry. It's not a state one. He's still facing some pretty serious state charges. And
he's probably got some deal with them, but whether it's in writing as an immunity agreement yet, who knows?
Oh boy,
but he probably has an idea of what he was promised.
I want to know who's defending Autry. I don't know. And some of the stuff that Autry said, if the prosecution thinks that he was lying on the stand about some of this stuff, then that any attempt at an immunity agreement might be out the window. But part of me is looking at this guy and saying, look, is he more worried about taking cheap shots at the defendant and the Bobos? Is this a dispute where all the people who are wrapped up in this care about is either helping or trashing one another, a family feud situation, and they almost don't care what happens to them with the authorities? Because I kind of get that vibe from this sometimes. You know what I mean?
Well, look, he had no feelings at all. None for the Bobo family when he was on the stand. He had no feelings of remorse that came across on the stand for his part in this. If you believe him completely in totality, his part was she was still alive, and he didn't try and do anything about it when they were dumping her body. And he calls her, the B word, and says this B is still alive. Knowing that Holly's family's right in the courtroom too. He showed nothing. He didn't show anything to me that, I don't even know if I'm Holly's mom, if I'm able to sit in that courtroom during that, because he did take shots. And then, shots at, our guest earlier made this comment about just shots at Zach Adams too. He brought up about an incestual relationship between Zach and his brother Dylan. And apparently, according to reporters in the courtroom, Zach looked like he wanted to come up out of his seat when Autry said that. So I think he was there. I don't know. I think the guy, if he thinks he mentioned finding God in jail, I'm not sure how much that's really going on, because he did not come across sorry and remorseful on the stand.
Well, I suppose we'll never know that. I guess that's between him and God. But look, we've the journalist we had on earlier today was of the impression that whole incest conversation that came out on the stand was probably not true, but it was Autry's way of just firing a cheap shot back at the defendant for saying, hey, look, you asked me to hide a body and now I'm sitting here dealing with all this garbage. I'm going to make you look like a slime bag. So if it's not true and it was intended for that purpose, honestly, I believe that journalist theory.
Right. No.
Yes. I mean, that could have been what that was all about. But even then, it's like, well, why say it under oath? I don't know. I mean, it's a lot of like I said, kind of like a feud. It's a feud between people who have known one another for a long time. And then the investigators come in and they're trying to unravel it.
Right. Okay. So I think we're maybe taking one more question. Bria Babe from the chat room says, is the reason we don't get to see or hear Shane's statement / deposition, this is Shane Austin, that there can't be any cross? So quickly answer that about a witness or now co-defendant that is now deceased, and why his statements didn't really come in.
Okay, so if it goes back to the rules of evidence, and the way that it works is this, and sorry, the book that I always keep here that people laugh at me about is in my briefcase. It's not up here on the table, but I'll paraphrase it. If a witness is unavailable, that is one of the exceptions to the hearsay rule. Well, let me back up. It's an out-of-court statement that would be offered to prove the truth of the matter. In other words, the truth of the deposition. And since it's a statement that was said outside court, it's hearsay. The question is whether one of the exceptions to the hearsay rule applies. Well, there is an exception for a witness that is unavailable. If a witness is unavailable, previous statements can come into court, but on top of that, you got to run a confrontation clause analysis under the Constitution, because a defendant has a constitutional right to confront the witnesses against him. The presumption is that a previous statement can only come into a criminal trial of that nature if it was under oath and subject to cross-examination. A deposition is not subject to cross-examination. Presumably, at least most aren't. Some are. They're rare. But if it was a statement to investigators or even a deposition and it wasn't subject to cross-examination, then it doesn't come in. My guess is that it wasn't subject to cross-examination. Therefore, the exception to the hearsay rule doesn't apply, and the confrontation clause kicks in to keep it out of court.
Okay, let me quickly get to this, because thank you to a Twitter follower who has given us information on Natalie Bobo, and that she did speak, and she actually spoke to Bert Staggs, who was your guest this afternoon. She spoke to him a couple of days ago and told him that she did in fact work at Teaser Strip Club, but that her employment began after the disappearance of her cousin Holly. Staggs says Natalie even offered to release her employment contract as proof that what was said about her in court was a lie and could be easily disproved. She told him she did know of Adams through Rebecca Earp, his girlfriend, but denied a personal relationship. So Natalie Bobo was denying any personal relationship with Zach Adams. She told him he hoped her cousin's killer was brought to justice and she no longer lives in Tennessee. This might be why she's not called. She no longer lives in Tennessee. Nick Barris from Channel 5 says, I'm told a subpoena was issued for Natalie to appear in court, but for now it looks like she will not be coming to testify. Yeah, okay. So that was from a couple days ago. So I'm really glad. Thank you to the Twitter follower that gave me that information, because people have been wondering if she had issued a statement. Yeah, we're going to actually switch to a clip now. This is Rebecca Earp, the defendant's ex-girlfriend, talking about how Zach Adams was the morning that Holly Bobo disappeared. Well, actually, I don't think we will go there, because shockingly, the minute I said that, things started to cook in the Morris Brothers trial. So all of a sudden, bam, the judge is on the bench and they're ready to go. So Cathy Russon, senior trial producer here at LawNewz, thanks for talking about the Holly Bobo case here as we try to unravel what's going on, because it's a convoluted one. And we're going to switch back to the Morris Brothers case in Phoenix, Arizona now. This is a trial of 2 NBA players and 1 other man accused of an assault on a victim who the defense claims is just after those NBA players for money.